As I in hoary winter's night stood shivering in the snow, surprised I was with sudden heat, which made my heart to glow. With the first two lines of the burning babe, the reader finds oneself immersed in the Christmas pastoral. In the snow-covered land of merry old England, the poem's unnamed protagonist has a vision. A pretty babe, all burning bright, did in the air appear, who scorched with excessive heat, such floods of tears did shed. The crying infant's tears of fire melt the snow and the heart of the lyric's eye. Yet this is not your average burning infant, as if there is such a thing as an average burning infant. The fiery infant begins to speak, which I imagine would be even more stunning. The metal in this furnace wrought are men's defiled souls. For as now on fire I am to work them to their good, so will I melt into a bath to wash them in my blood. With this, he vanished out of sight and swiftly shrunk away. And straight I called unto mind that it was Christmas Day. Merry Christmas. The inflamed infant explains the reason he is on fire. He is the furnace that softens the hardened heart of men. He will liquefy himself, becoming blood. I suppose Halloween meets Christmas. And bathe the sins of men. The babe that receives the bath normally actually gives the bath that soothes the wounds of the world. Not your average Christmas pastoral. There is no gentle encounter with the Blessed Virgin Mary cooing her son to sleep. You do not find the Lord Jesus surrounded by cherubic hosts. Instead, there is a shocking, almost horrifying encounter with a burning babe who already points towards death. Even the name of this babe is never used. I suspect we won't read this in my own home come this Christmas Eve. The Burning Babe is a lyric composed by St. Robert Southwell, S.J., who was hanged at Tyburn near the present-day Marble Arch in London on the 21st of February for being a Catholic priest and thus a traitor. His feast day, at least within England, is the 4th of May, one that he shares with 39 other English martyrs, including St. Edward Campion, perhaps the sort of best known. The irony of St. Robert Southwell is that although most of us in the church have not heard of him, the Academy has. The great English poet, dramatist, and literary theorist Ben Jonson admired the Burning Babe to such an extent that he noted that he wished it was a lyric that he had composed. Southwell's poetry has enjoyed a renaissance in the 20th century, no longer dismissed for its simple style. The martyred priest of England is now recognized for influencing the later work of the Anglican divines George Herbert and John Donne. He's mentioned in the same breath as Shakespeare. In fact, Shakespeare likely read him. Yet this is a talk in a series entitled Saturdays with the Saints, not Saturdays with important literary figures who were either once Catholic or secretly Catholic or who had Catholic sympathies. That's next year's series. Southwell is a saint not because he was a poet. After all, there are poets who are not saints. He is a saint because he was martyred, because his own blood testified to the burning love of the babe. Still, we should not be so quick to dismiss the poet's craft. For Southwell's poetry was part of his ministry, of nourishing the imagination of English Catholics in settings where all altarpieces, all rood screens, all images of Christ and his dear mother had been destroyed, fundamentally mostly replaced by images of the Queen. In this presentation, I will bring us into the heart of his devotional poetry, looking at themes related to childhood. Faced with the political and religious machinations of Queen Elizabeth I, English Catholics were powerless to practice their faith. Their churches, or at least in public, Their churches, once suffused with the presence of Christ, were now empty. They had become like orphan children, as Southwell often describes it, longing for a home, a church where one may gaze upon the Lord. Southwell's project offers this possibility by creating a space where one may discover in the mind an image of the Eucharistic Christ, that one may offer one's body itself to the Lord. This presentation will consist of 4 parts. First, I'll provide a bit more biographical information about Southwell, locating him in the cultural renewal brought about by the Jesuits at the beginning of the Catholic Reformation, or Counter-Reformation. Second, I'll turn to a sequence of poems on the Blessed Virgin Mary, showing how they become dramatic, playful meditations upon the life of Christ that soothe the English Catholic longing for image. Third, I'll turn to his Eucharistic poetry, where through the delight of phrase, he serves as poet-priest, forming his congregation for the self-gift of martyrdom. And lastly, I'll offer a reflection on Southwell's contribution to cultural evangelization in our own day. The life of poet-priest Southwell. Robert Southwell was born to Norfolk gentry living in an old Benedictine monastery that had been reclaimed after the Reformation. So they were a Catholic family living in an old Benedictine monastery secretly. He lived near the ruins of Our Lady of Walsingham, the 3rd most popular pilgrimage site in Europe during the Middle Ages. The Holy House at Walsingham was the result of a vision of the Blessed Virgin Mary by an English noblewoman. She saw the home of the Blessed Virgin Mary in Nazareth, the place where the Holy Family lived and grew up. In 1538, Henry VIII burned the house to the ground, one of the many acts of iconoclasm that shook the very psyche of English Catholics. Not all images in churches were destroyed. Southwell's families, they were hidden Catholics. His mother, Bridget Copley, was an educated woman who was an attendant to Queen Elizabeth. Catholicism was tolerated in England under Queen Elizabeth if you were important enough and you kept quiet enough. William Byrd, a composer for the Queen, was a known Catholic whose works are still sung in Catholic parishes today. In fact, he composed a series of works around the Graduale, which had been outlawed. But it was cool, because she liked his music. It is not surprising that Southwell's own parish church of St. Faith's, today St. Mary and St. Andrew's, has a surviving rood screen with medieval images of exotic saints that should not have survived. It's the oldest such in a surviving parish church in England. As long as one practiced the religion of the state in public, then private life could unfold however one wanted. Southwell left England at the age of 14, sent to study at the English College at Douai in Flanders. Here, Southwell met his first Jesuit. Now, this doesn't sound remarkable to us, but let's remember the Jesuits aren't especially old, and they're definitely not English. This is the order that he would eventually enter. He left Douai because of a political plot against Spain, heading off to Paris, where he studied under the Jesuit Thomas Derbyshire. He was formed in Latin and English, mainly using the vernacular to compose works that would fight against the heresies of Henry VIII's Reformation. His goal was not to be an English poet, but to serve the controversies of the church. By the time he returned to England as a Jesuit priest, his English style had functionally been formed as a 14-year-old boy. He thought in Latin, spoke Italian, and sometimes wrote in English. That Southwell entered the Jesuits in 1580 was a break away from his family. The Jesuits were not going to remain hidden. The Jesuits were a new order, unlike the Benedictines he had initially encountered in England. Founded in 1534 in France by Ignatius of Loyola, the order became public enemy number 1 in England. It was considered problematic, not simply because it was Catholic. The Jesuits were, and by the way, often still are, Catholic. It's a cheap shot, but none of them are here. The Jesuits were, though, more importantly, not English. They were founded in Spain with loyalties to the Pope. It is no accident that among the 40 English martyrs, a quarter were Jesuit. Southwell's entrance into the Society of Jesus did not occur immediately. They did not want him. In 1578, he went off to Rome to attempt to enter the Jesuits. He walked down and hadn't yet been through his novitiate, but was hopeful that they would just allow him entry. They didn't. He was actually only finally admitted to the novitiate in 1578, late 1578. In 1580, he began studies at the Jesuit College in Rome, receiving his BA in 1584, when he was also ordained a priest. In this very year, it was announced by Queen Elizabeth that any Catholic priest who had entered orders since her coronation, who remained in England for 40 days or more, would be subject to execution. In entering the Jesuits, Southwell had immersed himself in a religious order concerned with a cultural renewal of Catholicism. For us, perhaps the adjective Baroque evokes gaudiness or excessiveness. But the Baroque style promoted by the Jesuits was not understood this way in Rome. The paintings in the churches were intended to serve the devotional program of the Jesuits, of entering contemplatively and dramatically into the narrative of salvation. The paintings in churches and the colleges in Rome were part of a pedagogy of reforming the imagination, of doing the serious work of soulcraft. This pedagogy, grounded in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, included meditations, drama, and poetry. This program of cultural renewal, grounded in the spiritual exercises, influenced Southwell's poetry and prose alike. In his own private meditations, which would later be circulated, such as his longing for communion, which is one of the meditations, he describes how one must attune the soul to the act of devotion. This is a quote from him. "If Our Lady were again to bear Christ in her womb, and were to know the very hour and moment of his coming, with what diligence she would prepare herself, how constant would be her acts of love, with what care she would make ready the temple of her heart, with how many tears, sighs, and fervent ejaculations would she yearn for the coming of that day and that hour. And when she knew the time to be at hand, with what humility and devout reverence would she recollect herself, utterly absorbed, doubtless, then, in the contemplation of God and in mercy, so that pierced through and through with the fire of love, she would seem to lose herself in God, and utterly oblivious of earth, to be amongst the heavenly choir of the angels, and to be there communing with him whom she was about to receive." This exercise of the imagination was Southwell's own reflections as a Jesuit in formation. It's dramatic, demanding that the reader, whether it was Southwell or us, enter into the drama of salvation that is the reception of the Eucharist. This formation would serve Southwell in his own poetic project, where he would paint such images for English Catholics through the poetic word. In 1586, Southwell left Rome for England, arriving on July 7th, the feast of Thomas Becket. A sort of happy arrival. Edmund Campion had been martyred in 1580, changing the approach of Jesuits ministering in England. The original goal was to form English Catholics for a fervent devotion, to abide in a space where the martyrdom of tears was more important than the martyrdom of blood. That had changed. The Jesuit college in Rome began to include cycles of paintings not in the church, but in common spaces, depicting the martyrdom of Jesuits. This is the first, of course, image of this. Jesuits are not yet saints. If you look at a sort of Jesuit sanctuary cycle today, if you're at Boston College, for example, when you go to Mass, every day is a Jesuit saint now. It's sort of, they have their own All Saints Day, the Jesuits, because the normal one is not good enough. So, at this stage, there are no saints, and so the program of painting involves no Jesuits in the churches. There's no sort of, so they begin to be put in the halls, into the refectory, into sort of the places where these young Jesuit novices are studying. In the churches themselves, you could find the images of early martyrs flayed and bloody, now serving a new pedagogical purpose. This may be your destiny. Of course, Southwell wasn't foolish. Jesuit priests did not arrive in England and ask for an altar to say private mass. Many Jesuit priests were sent to England disguised as artists. Southwell was understood as a poet first, finding refuge in the house of recusant Catholics. From the continent, many of these households had received copies of some of these paintings from Rome, and so were actually sort of being influenced by this new style. As Anne Sweeney writes about this project, a scholar of Southwell, cultural activities were both a disguise for and a means of expressing their religion, an admixture of cultural, spiritual, or aesthetic boundaries, which would have seemed an elegant, succinct reflection of the interconnectedness of God and his universe to Renaissance minds, its hidden potency a reflection of divine immanence. Such a project would have been important to English Catholics, who needed to perceive in a desacralized landscape of churches now emptied of the Eucharistic presence, the possibility of God dwelling among them. Much of his time in England, Southwell wrote works of both prose and poetry. His works, both Catholic and non-Catholic, circulated anonymously. So he actually wrote Catholic poems, such as we'll look at today, but also just general poems reflecting on the fragility of life, in essence trying to convert basic humanists to religious practice. He wrote works during this time intended to comfort English Catholics, to prepare them for the possibility of death. He wrote a work to the Queen asking that she allow Catholics to practice their religion. This was not greeted positively. He relied upon the very rhetorical approach he was taking in his poetry. He wrote a work exhorting his father to take seriously the responsibility of faith and began to sort of send it around anonymously. In a world in which public display of Catholicism was not possible, in which public lectures could not be given, Southwell's writing became his ministry. Yet suspicion reigned, and it's not easy to hide forever, especially in a small place like England. By 1592, he was arrested and tortured. He was covered in maggots and lice, refusing to admit that his priesthood was a matter of treason. He was found guilty and sentenced to death, sent to be hanged at Tyburn on February 21st, 1595. In a narrative account of his death, in a sort of devotional work, D.H. Moseley writes, "Being accustomed to pray in Latin, he began, Sancta Maria Mater Dei et omnes sancti Dei, orate et intercedete per me. Holy Mary, Mother of God, and all the saints of God, pray and intercede for me." He made the sign of the cross and continued, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. God be merciful to me, a sinner." Another sign of the cross, and again, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." A third time he made the sign of the cross and said, "Into thy hands." Then he uttered verses from the Psalm Miserere, Psalm 51. The cart was drawn away from under his feet, and Southwell was left hanging from the gallows. The practice was normally to disembowel the person, but his executors had mercy upon him. They pulled his feet, bringing a quick end to his life. Of course, afterwards, he would later be drawn and quartered, his head placed on a pike on London Bridge, a sign that indeed he was a traitor, and also a very effective way to avoid relics. Of course, the irony is that Southwell only became more popular amongst both Catholics and Anglicans after his death. His poetry was collected anonymously and circulated. His poem, St. Peter's Complaint, and the prose drama, St. Mary Magdalene's Tears, went from edition to edition, beloved by Catholics and Protestants alike. Shakespeare referenced Southwell in The Merchant of Venice. Donne, Herbert, Crashaw, and Gerard Manley Hopkins were all influenced by him. Whether he was aware of it or not, Southwell had been successful in part of his project. Through the ministry of writing, through poetic compositions, he had kept Catholicism entrenched in England's literary blood, even if it required that he spill his own. That's the Jesuit, which is the Jesuit church in Rome. Now I'd like to turn to a cycle of poems he wrote around the Blessed Virgin Mary. Southwell's life and death gives us new insight into the depth of his poetry, not its death. His poetic compositions were intended to become a gift to English Catholics, yet were also meant to prepare them for the ultimate sacrifice of their life. His Marian cycle of poems, particularly his treatment of childhood in this poetry, shows how he prepared himself and others for martyrdom, nourishing the imagination in the hidden possibilities of sacrificial love. Southwell's poems on the Blessed Virgin employ the second-person plural. It is the entire church gathered around Mary who create images to adore the living God in a space where such worship is not possible. Public worship may be outlawed, but in the freedom of the reader and the community's minds, adoration may unfold. Such hidden worship is a theme of these poems, grounded in the mystery of childhood. In the conception of Our Lady, Southwell exclaims, "What grace to men or angels God did part was all united in this infant's heart," speaking of Mary. Divine grace unfolds in the birth of the Blessed Virgin Mary, prepared from the beginning of time for her role in salvation. Although the Ave Maris Stella, Hail, Star of the Sea, a Marian antiphon from the 8th century, was no longer sung in public. In the proclamation of the poem, Our Lady's Nativity, we cry out, "Joy in the rising of our orient star, that shall bring forth the sun that lent her light, in joy in the peace that conclude our war." Hidden in this poem is that Marian antiphon, the praise of the Blessed Virgin, who comes not simply to end the war of sin and death once upon a time, but the war of persecution endured by English Catholics here. As the poetic cycle continues, the play between natural and supernatural, between drama and nature increases, or between grace and nature increases in drama. In the Visitation, the Blessed Virgin comes to see Elizabeth alone. He notices this. She goes by herself, and it's normally not a great idea for pregnant women who are very pregnant to travel alone. So he noticed this likely in his own private contemplation of the scene. Southwell writes, "A prince she is, and mightier prince doth bear, yet pomp of princely train she would not have. But doubles heavenly choir attendants were, her child from harm, herself from fall to save. Word to the voice, song to the tune she brings, the voice her word, the tune her ditty sings." There's much hidden to contemplate in this scene, and in fact, that's the gift of this poetry. And my recommendation for you is to go out and get a copy of it. Of course, there is the hiddenness of the Christ child, of the princely procession that would have contrasted with the program of political power implemented by Elizabeth. This is not pomp. There is no heavenly band that accompanies. There are the hidden angels who sing along with Mary, an angelic host that had been erased in the English Catholic imagination, as cherubs were considered a matter of superstition. It was argued that angels had a point. In history, they once did God's message, but now there are no angels. And of course, the Jesuits had a vast program of angelic analysis. If you go into the Jesuit and you go into these churches, and they're often mocked because all these sort of fat baby angels are everywhere. And that's just not just because of bad taste, right? Like my grandmother, who just passed recently, loved a fat baby angel. I mean, if you could get her a fat baby angel, she would put it prominent on her shelf. Well, for the Jesuits, the angels were actually part of an elaborate sort of analysis of how God's grace functioned in the world. Our feelings, our affections, our sorrow, and our contemplation were brought about through the angelic host. So the presence of angels reveal a world where divine grace is operative, where grace is being mediated. The precariousness of the situation is acknowledged. A pregnant woman walking along a path to visit her cousin, the danger of a fall ever present. A painting is given to the mind to perceive the event as it unfolded. Music, although unheard, rings out through the silence of the Word made flesh present in her womb. Her tune, a ditty, plays off another English word, of which it is spelled very similar to, duty. Her obedience of will is her song. The public worship that no one can see or hear. The children will participate in this act at the end, finally greeting one another with secret signs. The children, that is St. John the Baptist and Jesus, greet each other, but open praise each leaveth to his mother. So now she speaks words of praise while St. John the Baptist and Christ become silent, partially because they're in the womb. This play of silence and open praise continues in the Nativity of Christ. He offers a traditional interpretation of the Nativity, grounded in the wonder of Christ's silence. The word is dumb, the mirth of heaven doth weep. Mighty feeble is, and force doth faintly creep. In the infant Christ, there are tears that represent the joy of heaven itself. The word is dumb, the mirth of heaven doth weep. Mighty feeble is, and force doth faintly creep. In Christ's infancy, there are tears that represent the joy of heaven. In the infant Christ, there's a force belied by weakness. Suddenly, Southwell moves from this contemplation of the birth of Christ in silence to a direct address to the reader. O dying souls, behold your living spring. O dazzled eyes, behold your Son of grace. Dull ears, attend what word this word doth bring. Up, heavy hearts, with joy your love embrace, or with joy your joy embrace. From death, from dark, from deafness, from despairs, this life, this light, this word, this joy repairs. The stanza is stunning. You can see influence of Southwell on Hopkins in sort of word next to word, sort of just playing with one another. It's as if one is standing before a chapel of the Nativity, an image of Christ born among the beasts of the earth. There's a celebration going on, images often depicted with angelic host presence. There's also a word play, an invitation of contemplation that we'll see later in the Eucharistic poetry. Death and life, dark and light, deafness and word, joy and despair, paradox. Human existence unfolds between these two dramatic dimensions. And the Nativity is the unfolding of this drama, hidden from the eyes of the world. The circumcision of Jesus draws the reader anew into the hidden suffering of mother and son. Christ's circumcision is already a vision of the suffering that he'll endure, the martyrdom that our Lord will undergo. It is a feast absent from the 1559 Book of Common Prayer, a feast forgotten in the public worship of England entirely. For Southwell, the circumcision is seen Eucharistically, pointing to the cross. The vein of life distilleth drops of grace. Our rock gives issue to an heavenly spring. Tears from his eyes, blood runs from wounded place, which showers to heaven of joy a harvest spring. This sacred dew let angels gather up. Such dainty drops best fit their nectared cup. There's a playfulness in this poetry that you have to sort of encounter. Of course, it's a dreadful scene, right? I remember when my own son was received his circumcision in the hospital. It was the darkest moment, I think, of my life. I didn't even see it. I just saw him return in pure and absolute misery, the first wound of his childhood given to him quite young. But of course, it really is a horrifying event. But it's also, it refers to the blood that comes off of such a tiny member, shall we say, such dainty drops, right? So you're invited to envision the smallest of drops that sort of are given to the angels. Christ's blood is already infused with hidden grace, the spring of life that comes up from the ground. His suffering is evident. Tears and blood, which although a matter of sorrow, water the ground for the richest harvest. You can see here, this is a later painting from Peter Paul Rubens, but of the circumcision, the kind of paintings that would have started to have been painted in this style in Rome, that would have allowed for, you can see the drama of the circumcision with the angels sort of there. The blood that is shed is collected by the angelic host who gather up the dainty drops to manifest that first Eucharistic sacrifice of love in the nectared cup. But Christ is not alone. His suffering is also his mother's. For, as he writes, his life and hers hung by one fatal twist. No blow that hit the son, the mother missed. If the Blessed Virgin is to suffer with the Lord, then English Catholics should expect likewise. Such suffering is not reserved just for the Blessed Virgin Mary, but even those first first Christian martyrs, the holy innocents praised by Southwell in his poem on the flight to Egypt. O blessed babe, first flowers of Christian spring, who though untimely cropped fair garlands frame, with open throats and silent mouths you sing, his praise whom age permits you not to name. Your tunes are tears, your instruments are swords, your ditty death, and blood in lieu of words. Just like our Lord, the infants cannot speak. They cannot cry out, but they can sing in their blood. It is in their sacrifice that their worship unfolds. The cycle of poem ends with Our Lady's death and her Assumption into heaven. Like the Feast of the Circumcision, the Feast of the Assumption on August 15th was suppressed with the Book of Common Prayer. This great summer feast in which Christian hope could sing the promise of the resurrection, Mary, as the poem says, first teaches us to die. It was no death to her, but to her woe, by which her joys began, her griefs did end. Death was to her a friend, to us a foe. And her Assumption into heaven, the second fruit of redemption after Christ, gives hope for recusant Catholics whose queen seeks to end their life, but whose queen in heaven now lives among the choirs of saints with songs of hymns and praise. This Marian cycle brings us to contemplate the hidden love of Christ and the Blessed Virgin. It is a performance, a drama in which we become participants through reading the poetry. The readers at the time of Southwell prepared for martyrdom, for the final death, but each one is to see in the hidden mystery of love an invitation toward the tears of repentance. As Southwell concludes his A Child My Choice, Almighty Babe, whose tender arms can force all foes to fly, correct my faults, protect my life, direct me when I die. The Eucharistic cycle of poetry in Southwell. And this is a scene of the main altar in the main altar at the Jesuit in Rome. And so this is the Jesuit church. And these programs of altar paintings, people didn't just paint paintings on walls because they needed to do something with the walls. They were actually sort of programs of Eucharistic contemplation. You can kind of see maybe one of the largest altar pieces ever created. If you've ever been to the Sistine Chapel, you can see it. As one is receiving Eucharist, you gaze and see the last judgment of the world before your eyes. Something that's always good for me to think about, the fact that popes elect popes there. Southwell's poetry does not simply deal with Mary, whose many feasts had been eliminated from the calendar. Rather, this poetry deals most of all with the silence of the Eucharistic mystery. Literary scholars have noted how devastating the Reformation's departure from Eucharistic communion was for the English soul. It's not that the Eucharist disappears entirely, but it does disappear almost entirely from the social and cultural world that it created. Southwell came armed with Eucharistic poetry to assist the English Christians in offering the sacrifice of the Mass wherever they could, at least in their mind. He translated Thomas Aquinas' hymn for Corpus Christi, again a suppressed feast. The Feast of Corpus Christi in medieval England was the commencement of the summer feasting, filled with dramas such as the York Mystery Cycle of plays, which were to be performed no more. This feast detailed God's radical kenosis in entering into human history, a presence of love that changed the social order. The loss of the Eucharist was for this reason devastating. Sure, Masses were available, but not ubiquitous. Southwell's two original Eucharistic compositions, Of the Blessed Sacrament of the Altar, and Christ's Bloody Sweat, attempt to restore a Eucharistic imagination for the recusant Catholics. Of the Sacrament of the Altar uses imagery related to bodily presence. The disciples gathered at the Last Supper. They saw, they heard, they felt him sitting near, unseen, unfelt, unheard they him receive. Of course, this is the sense that the Eucharist is the full transubstantiated presence of Christ, and that what they see him, but they do not yet see what they've received. It is Christ's total presence made available, entirely unseen by the apostles. Christ takes up a program of formation of the senses in the Eucharist, an embodied presence of intimacy that touches every dimension of the human body. The same poem declares, "To ravish eyes, here heavenly beauties are. To win the ear, sweet music's sweetest sound. To lure the taste, the angels' heavenly fare. To soothe the scent, divine perfumes abound. To please the touch, he in our hearts doth bed, whose touch doth cure the deaf, the dumb, the dead." One may not be able to see the Eucharist, to hear the songs of the angelic hosts, to sing the Sanctus, to eat Christ's body and blood regularly, to smell the incense rising up in churches. But Christ is present in the heart, bedded with the Christian. Often Southwell will draw on nuptial imagery, which is not surprising because he was influenced by this mystical tradition. His presence is still available in the heart. The sense of touch placed last, an interior touch, makes possible a Eucharistic communion that is otherwise impossible. Christ's bloody sweat is a different poem entirely. It actually doesn't seem Eucharist at all at the beginning, but a flowing out of the words, the poem itself actually is a Eucharistic one. So I handed it to you because it's long enough that I wanted to give it to you, and it's also, you have to see it to see how remarkable it is. So we'll begin with the first stanza. Fat soil, full spring, sweet olive, grape of bliss, that yields, that streams, that pours, that dost distill, untilled, undrawn, unstamped, untouched of press, dear fruit, clear brooks, fair oil, sweet wine at will. Thus Christ unforced prevents in shedding blood the whips, the thorns, the nails, the spear, and rood. This semi-acrostic moves the reader toward an interpretation of Christ's sacrifice that is Eucharistic. It can be read in a variety of ways. Full soil that streams, unstamped, sweet wine at will, or full spring that pours, undrawn, dear fruit. It allows the reader to find an infinite number of possibilities for understanding the Eucharistic sacrifice, a sort of contemplation of the Eucharist without the Eucharist present. There's an infinite understanding. In addition, the last line, the whips, the thorns, the nails, the spear, and rood, are all sort of signs of the instruments of torture that had been, this was a great devotion in these churches, was to venerate the instruments of torture. But now they're presented again to the reader through words to envision. The second stanza ends up taking up this love of the sacrifice of the cross. He pelicans, he phoenix faith doth prove, whom flames consume when streams enforce to die. How burneth blood, how bleedeth burning love. Can one in flame and stream both bathe and fry? How could he join a phoenix, fiery pains, in fainting pelicans, still bleeding veins? Pelicans, in both ancient and medieval Christianity, are known as creatures who consume their own flesh for their young, feeding them. If you go to the altar at the back of the Basilica at Notre Dame and look at the Bernini altar, which is from Bernini's school, it's not from Bernini, you'll notice on the altar is a pelican feeding itself. It's also the state flag of Louisiana, the most Catholic of all states. The phoenix is the fiery mythological creature rising from the ashes toward new life. But a problem is introduced for the reader, a catechesis of divergence. Can one in flame and stream both bathe and fry? How do you both bathe and fry? How could he join a phoenix fiery pains in fainting pelicans still bleeding veins? The narrative of Elijah in the third stanza, an image of divine sacrifice, points towards the answer. Elijah tricks the priest of Baal to attempt to offer a sacrifice. They do, and fire descends from heaven, consuming the wood, the stones of the altar, and the priests themselves. False worship is consumed by God. But even more importantly, the heart, if that can burn, if stone and wood and human flesh can burn, then the human heart can become the place of sacrificial love, of total offering. Such fire is love that fed with gory blood doth burn no less than in the driest wood. In the heart, God's fire can consume. The last stanza now moves toward a resolution. It turns now for a performance by the reader. O sacred fire, come show thy force on me, that sacrifice to Christ I may return. If withered wood for fuel fittest be, if stones and dust of flesh and blood will burn, I withered am, and stone to all good, a sack of dust, a mass of flesh and blood. You can read this darkly, that all we are is nothing but a sack of dust, a mass of flesh and blood. Or you could actually read it in a positive sense, that all we are is a sack of dust, a mass of flesh and blood. Yet, returning again to the first stanza, that Christ unforced prevents in shedding blood, the whips, the thorns, the nails, the spear, and rood. It is for this sack of dust that Christ has sacrificed his existence. It is for this sack of dust that now I can offer this return gift of love through martyrdom. I often think of this poem as something that English Catholics might have prayed, unable to sort of participate in the Eucharistic offering. Conclusion. Southwell's hidden project of inviting English Catholics to offer worship to the living God in a hostile setting had effects beyond the recusant community. George Herbert's The Altar, in his work The Temple, takes up many of the themes found in Southwell. A broken altar, Lord, thy servant rears, made of a heart and cemented with tears, whose parts are as thy hand did frame. No workman's tool hath touched the same. A heart alone is such a stone, as nothing but thy power doth cut. Wherefore each part of my hard heart meets in this frame to praise thy name, that if I chance to hold my peace, these stones to praise thee may not cease. O let thy blessed sacrifice be mine, and sanctify this altar to be thine. The Eucharistic act of self-gift, of self-love, a self-giving love, begins from the visible world and moves into the heart. It is the human being, even in Herbert, who did in fact have a sense of the Eucharist, that is to become the sacrifice. In the years since, the Eucharist has not disappeared from the life of the Church in the United States. Yet numbers testify to a process of secularization that is serious enough to be worrisome. There is a desire for response by the Church grounded in an evangelical approach to ministry. If only people became true disciples, true believers, then the Church would flourish. The Jesuits of old were actually concerned about this, also the Jesuits of new. They wanted a devotional life that was serious, engaged with the world. They wanted Catholics to perceive in creation the presence of sacrificial love. And they implemented a program to carry this out, a cultural renewal grounded in art, drama, theater, and music. Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who built the Vatican colonnade at St. Peter's, who sculpted the ecstasy of St. Teresa, who built the baldacchino above St. Peter's altar, carried the spiritual exercises around with him. He attended Mass at the Jesuit, the Jesuit church in Rome. Cultural renewal and evangelization are not unlinked to one another. We need matter if we are to contemplate, to devote ourselves to the Eucharistic love of Christ. Southwell's sainthood in poetry stands as a radical sign of this. He was himself formed through this imagery, through this renewal of culture. It was the suffering Christ, the angelic hosts, Mary's wounded heart that were his spiritual exercises. Perhaps images that even today we would say, like, well, that's childish, or those are too devotional. From these exercises, he produced poetry that enabled both himself and English Catholics to offer this sacrifice of love where it was not possible. He built poetic altar pieces through human words, and he changed the very state of the English language in the process, assisting in the development of culture along with it. Though mostly forgotten, his sacrifice was efficacious. The past before us, or the present before us, is something like Southwell's. We can't just influence people's affections without forming their concrete imaginations through material means. We need fresh imagery, fresh art, fresh culture that can foster anew the sacrifice and love at the heart of the gospel. We have undergone in our own time our own iconoclasm, self-chosen. Churches emptied of images, altars devoid of decoration, the absence of incense, the erasure of music. Such an iconoclasm has deformed our own imagination, breaking the chain of memory necessary for Catholic life. Southwell serves as an icon for restoring this memory. We do not do so as cultural aesthetes, longing to be recognized by our artistic colleagues. We do so because the end of Christian life is the offering of the wounded heart in imitation of the crucified and risen Lord. We need matter to do this, and at least for now, unlike Southwell, we can do so in more than poetry. We can do so in painting, in music, in all that brings us to the childlike wonder that should reside in the Christian life. We should learn to look at our Lord anew, seeing the wonder of the burning babe. And I'll let Southwell have the last words. With joy approach, O Christian wight, do homage to thy King, and highly prize this humble room, which he from heaven doth bring. Thanks.
Friends, we have time for maybe one question, maybe two.
What kept going through my mind was at the beginning of the movie The Mission, Jeremy Irons' character, whose name I can't remember, starts his evangelization of the indigenous people by playing the flute. Was the arts an inherent part of Jesuit missionary work or evangelization?
Yeah, it was. And in fact, there's a whole major book on the Jesuits and culture and art. And it was necessary to their work to do this kind of evangelization through the arts, which would come to influence the rest of the church. I like to remind people of something very important in this. When even the Franciscan missionaries, so having now been influenced by the Jesuits' commitment to the arts, went to Mexico, one of the things they found were images of the sun above the sort of Aztec altars. And so actually they took up this image, and monstrances until this time did not have the sun. It wasn't until, so the thing that we see as the Eucharistic monstrance comes about through missionary artistic work, working amongst the Mexicans, which then comes back into Europe and renewing it. And so what you had was actually this renewal of the arts that would come to renew every dimension. So yeah, it was part of life. I mean, in the Jesuit novitiate, they did dramas and theater together, and it was sort of integral to their identity were to perform these dramas. And so you had actors being formed, and rhetoricians, and artists, and of course they're in Rome when there's this massive renewal of art going on in the church. Really, the St. Peter's we know is being built at this time.